Okay, good. I mean, this is a slightly strange room. It looks like a light storm was hitting me in some weird way. I don't know. I don't know how to name. I'm at the Artmore Hotel in Atlanta, Georgia, which is just a lovely old-fashioned hotel. That's actually sort of it is an old hotel, but it's been patched up and fixed up. Anyway, I'm excited tonight to introduce to you a book by Clarence Darrow called "Resist Not Evil," which was written in about 19. I think. Let me just look here. I think it's 19. Just look. I think it's 1902, which is an unbelievable point that is written in 1902. Because what you have here, and here's why I think this book is important. I mean, there are many varieties of anti-statist, pro-libertarian thought that are not crazy, that are really compelling, really practical, consequentialist and rights-based libertarianism that have somehow dropped out of history. And one of them is the Tolstoy anarchist school, Christian anarchism. Sometimes, and I understand why people are slightly reluctant to read this literature, sometimes when people tell me about, oh, there's a great lost anarchist, so-and-so, you should read him. I'm a little reluctant because I figure like any amount of their thought, from the late 19th century, early 20th century, maybe going back, 17th century, oh, here's a 15th century anarchist you have to read. It's like, my bias is to think like anything that's worth reading, if there were any ideas worth preserving in that literature, then they would have been absorbed into the modern anarcho-capitalist trend, and we should be able to discover them, all of them, by reading, and all the authors I love, Rothbard or David Friedman or Frank Chodoroff or whatever. And so I tend not to visit those people because my other problem is that you typically bump into errors like crazy views on sexuality or criminal justice or property rights or Proudhonian weirdness, and it's just too eccentric. I'd rather just read the pure modern stuff and sort of get my ideas from that. Well, so this book though is really an exception. So it's not it's somehow not made it into the canon. How can I say this? It's not as part of the canon that that modern anarcho-capitalists normally think of as being part of theirs, and I think it's tragic. And I don't know how to account for it except to say this is an oversight. The book is by Clarence Darrow, and it's one of the greatest books I've ever read in my life. In fact, people ask, what book do you recommend? Should I read? On liberty-minded political economic theory, examples, I talk about Chodoroff. I love that Chodoroff book on the rise and fall of society. Talk about Martin van Creveld on the rise and decline of the state. Mises' liberalism. Obviously, Rothbard's Foreigner Liberty, which is kind of a composite of all existing libertarian thought as it stood in 1972. Machinery of Freedom. And there are many books, too many to name here. But I don't actually believe that one's understanding can be complete until you discover and read Resist Not Evil by Clarence Darrow. By the way, tonight's broadcast is going to be short. I'm only going to do 30 minutes here, so I'm going to have to move very, very quickly here through this book. I'm doing this because we've got an editorial meeting at the Foundation for Economic Education in town, and we're all doing all sorts of things that are exciting and revolutionary for the future. So, but I could talk about this book for hours. Clarence Darrow was, of course, the defense attorney in the Scopes monkey trials. He defended a teacher of evolution against a criminal prosecution People forget about that case, that it was actually a criminal prosecution. It was illegal to teach the theory of evolution, and the guy, the teacher, was being, and Scopes Monkey trial was being held for violating a law on a criminal basis and faced jail time. And Clarence Darrow was the defense attorney in the case. Very famous guy. He was a defense attorney all of his life, and I'd never really understood that he had a bigger theory of the world until I read this book, Resist Not Evil. I'd never heard of the book until Douglas French, great thinker, former president of the Mises Institute, a great man, a serious intellectual force in the world today, drew it to my attention. And it was one of those books where I started reading it, and nothing else mattered, at that point. I don't know if you've ever encountered a book like that where you just can't stop, so lunch didn't matter, emails didn't matter, nothing mattered. I just had to read this book, and it was mind-blowing. I left that experience having read it, start probably hours, with my mind fundamentally changed on very important topics. And the topic is this: should the state have a monopoly on criminal justice? Does it even provide justice? Is that a job of the state? Is that something the state can do uniquely that the rest of society cannot do? Now, he doesn't make an argument for, it's not some wonky text about how, oh, if we left it to the free market, here's how courts and prisons would work. That's not his point. The point is to draw attention to the reality of criminal justice as it is known. Now, we're talking about 1902, right? You'd think that, oh, well, surely that system's not so as bad as our prison state today, where we have the largest prison in the United States, the largest prison population in the world, where anybody who's ever entered into it, discovers the truth of the matter. And if you have not entered into it, I've seen it firsthand now. Twice, actually. I've been arrested now twice, and been to jail now twice. So, it's disgusting that I would ever compare my experience with the many, many millions of people who are now suffering so much at the under the boot of the system, of this grinding, ghastly bureaucracy. So I'm not going to even go there, but I've seen a little bit of it, enough to know that it's shockingly corrupt. There's, last time I went to jail, and this is, I keep going to jail on these flukes, right? So the most recent time was that I paid a ticket a day late, and I got a sheet where they automatically suspend your license if you pay late. And so it was 24 hours late, and so the municipal court where I paid my ticket reinstated my license, but the reinstatement didn't apply to the place that actually issued my license, which was out of state. And since they usually batch up the information about who's paid what when in sort of clumps, maybe every 30 or 60 days, the state that issued my license did not get a notification of this, so listed me officially as suspended, even though I had a form with me saying that my suspension had been withdrawn. In any case, suddenly out of nowhere, the handcuffs were on me. I'm dragged off to jail, and I got to experience this, again, and it was no different from what it was the first time. And the things you notice about jail is that, well, most of the people there shouldn't be there. I don't know how else to put it. They should be out, should be free, should be just doing their thing. It's just ridiculous. I mean, my cellmate in this case was a similar case of a failure to, I wasn't a failure to appear, but he got arrested on a failure to appear. When they searched him, they found some pot flakes in his pocket, gave him a felony charge. He faces probably 10 years for possession of marijuana, bringing marijuana into a correctional facility. This is the nature of the system. The last time I was in jail, I was in a bigger city, and I got exposure to a greater number of inmates. I mean, there were people there for failure to pay child support because, they had some sense, they were running out of money. They had their own needs to provide for. The person they were supposed to be paying this money to was richer than they were, and wasn't but they weren't using the money anyway. I mean, there's a marital dispute, and basically one party ends up in jail. Others are just petty crimes. I mean, mostly people are jailed for failing to comply with the system, and the system is fundamentally corrupt. Basically, that's why people go to jail. It's not like the fantasy everybody believes, like, oh, here's a bad guy comes in, steals my silverware, the cops catch up with him. You know, now he's going to be punished. You know, and so justice is going to be realized. I mean, the number of cases in our criminal justice system for which that's true are virtually nil. But nonetheless, people continue to believe this is true. Darrow takes on a more fundamental topic. He's asking the question, why does this system exist in the first place? And he makes a number of extraordinary considered before, namely that jails and criminal justice, as we currently experience it, have nothing to do with justice. What justice is realized. Let's just say something horrible happens to you. You know, a crazy man, you know, shoots your daughter on the streets. Okay, catch up with him. He goes to jail. He's in life in prison. In what sense does that bring your daughter back? It doesn't. There is no justice. There can be no justice. There is no justice in the world. I'm sorry. It's just a terrible reality, but it's just true. There's no justice. The only thing that approximates justice is to provide for compensatory damages. So somebody steals your silverware, caught, they compensate you with enough money they give you back your silverware and compensate you for the loss of time. Now that happens in tort trials all the time. With non-criminal court, you know, damages are just part of what happens. But in criminal courts, the damages are never pertain. I mean, people who experience, you know, vast loss of life and property through actual real property crimes never are compensated. So there's no justice. There's certainly no justice on somebody who did something bad is caught languishing in jail forever. And also jails teach criminality. Your whole society becomes criminality. You know, the idea that anybody's going to get out of jail and suddenly, you know, a better person than when they entered into it is pretty much preposterous. But we adhere to the system. And why? Because we believe that that's what the state can do well. So Darrow's asking the question, what is a state and why do we think it connect criminal justice? And what are the actual consequences of this? What are the incentives this kind of system sets up? First of all, he has the best understanding of the state that I think I've read. And I'm something of an explorer and an accumulator of theories of the state, because one of the things that's really, really frustrated me about the libertarian tradition in general is that we don't take the state seriously. I know that sounds like a paradox, but it's true. We talk about state, oh, it's bad, it's evil, it does wreckage, whatever. But do we understand actually how it functions? What are the gears how do the gears work? You know, it's like if we were against cars and we never took a second to even understand how a car works. Libertarians are this way towards the state. We are against the state, but we never take even just a few minutes to even sit down and ask the question, how it works? How does it sort out its priorities? Why does it get up in the morning? Who is it serving and why? You know, it has to have some rationale beyond just pure intellectual error. I mean, you can have an intellectual error that creates a state. That doesn't cause the state to operate on an ongoing basis. I mean, what makes it work on Monday morning? What does it decide to do on Tuesday? How come one thing happens instead of another thing on Wednesday? Who's actually pulling the levers and why? And what are they serving? What causes they do things for no reason? And the state is nothing but an accumulation of people. Why are they doing what they do? Libertarians just don't think about the subject. Well, Tolstoy, Clarence Darrow has a really good theory about this whole thing, and his theory is essentially the state, which is an apparatus of violence and coercion and compulsion, operates according to a different law from the rest of society, does things that nobody else can do for risking being entrapped in the criminal justice system. The system can do it. What does the system do and who does it serve? And it serves, to his mind, a ruling class. And he opens the book talking about the nature of the state, and it's a beautiful section. Even if you didn't get into criminal justice, this would be beautiful in itself. Every government on earth is a personification of violence and force, and yet the doctrine of non-resistance is as old as human thought. Even more than this, the instinct is as old as life on earth. The beginnings of the state can be traced back to the early history of the human race, when the strongest savage seized the largest club and with his weapon enforced his rule upon other members of the tribe. Beautiful, beautiful description of the origin of this state. The history of the past and present alike proves that beyond a doubt that if there is or ever was any large class from whom society needed to be saved, it is those same rulers who have been placed in absolute charge of the lives and destinies of their fellow men. From the early kings, who with their blood-red hands forbade their subjects to kill their fellow men, to the modern legislator, who, with the bribe money in his pocket, still makes bribery a crime. These rulers have ever made laws, not to govern themselves, but to enforce obedience on their serfs. That's beautiful writing, right? This should be a quotable Darrow. The first great instrument which supports every government on earth is the soldier with his gun and sword. True, the army may be but rarely used. With the civil power, the civil courts of justice, the policemen and jails generally suffice in civilized lands to maintain existing things. But back of these, to enforce each decree, is the power of armed men with all modern implements of death. I'm just sampling a few things from this. Every people in the world is taught that their country and their government is the best on earth, and that they should ever be ready to desert their homes, abandon their hopes and aspirations and ambitions when their ruler calls, and this regardless of the right or wrong for which they fight. The teaching of patriotism and war permeates all of society and reaches the youngest child, and even shapes the character of the unborn babe. It fills the soul with false ambitions, with ignoble desires, and with sordid hopes. This is nice, isn't it? Isn't it just fabulous? Okay, what about what is civil government? Civil governments, like military governments, are instituted and controlled by the ruling class. Their purpose is to keep the earth and its resources in the hands of those who directly and indirectly have taken it for themselves, to retain rule, to retain control for the elites, is the purpose of the state. If you understand that, you understand everything there is to know. And yet, how often do we forget that? We forget it constantly. We forget it every day. I mean, you can't repeat that sentence enough. If you understand that, then you understand politics. True. This can only be done by the establishment and maintenance of certain rules and regulations concerning the disposition of property and the fate of men. A vast army of officials, governors, legislators, tax gatherers, judges, sheriffs, policemen, and the like are maintained by the governing class to enforce these rules and regulations and keep the exploited in their place. The decrees of courts and the various orders of civil government are enforced by a violence, differing only in kind from the general's commands. The decree of courts, whether rightful or wrongful, must be obeyed, and the penalty of disobedience is the forcible taking of property, the kidnapping and imprisoning of men, and, if need be, the taking of life. If it should ever occur that the civil authorities have not sufficient force to compel obedience, the whole power of the army and navy may at once be made subservient to the civil power. So I'm just going to close that for a second to make a really important point here. And I hope you understand what I'm about to say. Liberalism has traditionally said that justice and criminal courts and the enforcement of property rights and the making of rules for the social order must be monopolized by the state, and yet everything else must be free. Everything else must be free. This is a view that's been held since the time of Hobbes. It was Locke, it was Mises, Hayek. I mean, yeah, this has been a view that's permeated Jefferson, permeated classical liberalism forever, that everything can be free except this one, what's typically described as small area of criminal justice, where and rulemaking and rule enforcement. It makes sense, right? But you know what? That's a complete abstraction. Such a thing has never existed. What Darrow is pointing out is that this power to make laws, enforce laws, decide who is and is not a criminal, and to enact punishments based on them, is not just a narrow slice of state power. It's not just one little concession. It is the whole thing, without which the rest of the state could not work at all. If you're a thug who wants to rule others and take away their freedom, you don't need a social security system or even a Federal Reserve or minimum wages or the power to enact safety regulations or environmental concerns or bring about war or anything else. You only need, in the end, one power. And that power is to decide what is the law and what happens to you if you break it, and the power to bring about that result for non-compliance. You see what I mean? In other words, Darrow was taking on the night watchman himself. And saying this is the essence of the state. There is no other part of the state that really matters. Everything is an elaboration on that core thing, which is the night watchman. The night watchman sits in the tower, and he alone decides whether you're a prisoner or not, and what happens to you when you try to escape. So the irony is that the old liberal school of non-anarchist thought gave up the most fundamental institution. They said, we want total freedom, but we're going to give the state this one little power. Well, that one little power is all the power that despots need. That's it, nothing. So then he asked, okay, so I'm going to leave that there. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, but it's awesome. In other words, I mean, I'm elaborating here on what he says, but I mean, you know, when you're thinking about cutting the state, people often have this one power. According to Darrow's way of thinking, the power that people want to preserve for the state is the one and most important power that you want to get rid of. Nothing else matters. You can have all health and safety regulations and environmental stuff and war-making powers and you know, every kind of surveillance and censorship, and you name it. If you take away from the state the ability to make and enforce the laws, decide what they are and what happens to you if you break them, then all the other powers collapse. They're all dependent upon that one power. So if you want freedom, you might as well just forget about all the rest of the stuff that everybody's been talking about for hundreds and hundreds of years that the state shouldn't do, and just focus on the one most important area, which is law and criminal justice. And if you give up that one power, then you can forget the rest. I mean, you can throw out that one power, the rest collapses. If you concede that one power, the rest is a given. Once you make that concession, you're on the trajectory to a total state. And that's an awesome thing, because let's face it, the libertarian tradition, for that matter, the conservatives, the liberals, and everybody else, has not really thought about this. They've not really thought about this monopoly of violence that the state has. Yet it's the number one most important thing. Okay, so what does the state do with this power? And this is where it gets awesome. And you have to get to the section, I mean, you'll read a third of the way into the book. I'm not going to say anything about criminality, but the criminality section is that there's so much great in this book, but the stuff in criminality is the most important thing. So what does the state's criminal justice system do? What is it? Why does it get up in the morning? Why does it exist? What is its function? Its function is to create criminals. Not to diminish the number of criminals, but to make more of them. the more criminals it can make, the more it thrives, and the more the system lives and grows. So the state is tasked, like by society or by intellectuals or whatever, with reducing crime, but the state has every incentive to do exactly the opposite. Manufacture more criminals, make criminality more pervasive, find ever more ways to make more of them. And we're always shocked by this. You know, for example, it's very common these days for the government to run sting operations, you know, posing as an underage child or a drug dealer or whatever. And so many crimes are this way, you know, just these days, just government posing as it's just entrapment. So, and there's something funny about that, right? We go, why are we trapping? Is that really right to entrap people? I mean, have you really done a crime if you've agreed to sell heroin to the guy down the street, and it turns out he doesn't really exist, and suddenly the cops break into your house and accuse you of selling heroin that you didn't sell to nobody in particular? I mean, is that really right? That's entrapment, right? But that's entrapment is the thing that the government does to make more criminals. And it's not just that. That's why the state passes laws. That's why there's drug laws. That's why there's immigration laws, by the way. We can talk about that some other time. That's why all laws exist, solely to create more criminals. The more criminals it creates, the more successful it is. But that's exactly the opposite of what we think the system is supposed to do. We think the system is supposed to keep us safe from criminals. And in fact, what the system is doing is creating ever more. And you can see this in just the way the system operates. I mean, I had an interesting experience recently. I mean, the reason I was pulled over and the reason the cops grabbed me and arrested me was because there's a new law that says, it's called the move over rule, that when a cop is stopped on the side of the road, you're supposed to go to the left lane and slow down and stay as far away from them as possible and pass by slowly. And I didn't know about this rule, and I just kind of kept driving the right lane. I was like, oh, there's a policeman. I drove by. Well, that whole thing was, that whole scene that I witnessed was the cops testing compliance with the move over rule. They weren't moved over for any other reason other than to test whether or not people were moving over. And that's why I got my ticket, and that's why I was ultimately arrested. I mean, this is what the state does. They set up situations, make it impossible for you to comply. And in fact, nobody in the world today is compliant with a fraction of the state's rules. And they're made so that you can't comply with them, so that we all can become criminals at any one time. And the state needs this you know, it needs criminals the way dolphins want to eat fish. I mean, they have to be fed every day. You know, when I was in jail recently, when they found the pot in the guy's pocket, they were high-fiving each other. We got ourselves a felon. Well, this is a win. This is a win for the government. The more criminals they make, the more they are succeeding in achieving what they do. It's a grossly unjust system. It always has been. Again, this book was written in 1902. Amazing to think of. So that's what the system does. The more efficient and bigger the government is, the more criminals it makes. That's why there are truancy laws. I mean, that's why there are drug laws. That's why there's, you know, an uncountable. That's why the regulations for compliant or non-compliant, the government's rule could fill up this room with paper, probably 10 times over. There's an uncountable. Nobody can possibly know the law. You can't just reflect internally on what's right and what's wrong. No. It's not possible to know the law. The reason for that is that the state wants a system where everybody is non-compliant, essentially, so they can have an unlimited number of people violating the law to feed into their systems and into their prison systems, and to keep their judges busy and to keep the courts busy, and to continue to provide some sort of raison d'etre for why they exist at all. So you can see that it's like the opposite of private enterprise. You know, the purpose of McDonald's is to feed people hamburgers and to make a profit. The purpose of this hotel that I'm in is to get clients, to serve them well. And the purpose of the state is to manufacture more people who are in violation of its laws, not to incentivize you to keep the law, but to figure out ways that you can not comply. I mean, another great example of this is the laws on money laundering, right? So people, the higher taxes go and the more difficult it is to move money around. The state imposes ever more severe rules, so you can't move $10,000 in cash from any one institution to any other institution, or else you're guilty of smurfing. Or, no, I'm sorry, you just can't do that, right? But if you move like $9,000 3 times, that's also a violation of law, because what they say is that you're trying to you're just trying to get around the law through carefully structuring your transactions. In other words, you're keeping the law. So if you keep the law, that itself is a violation of the law. So it's not possible to comply with the law. I mean, that's just the way it is today. And why is that? We say, oh, that's stupid, that's random, that's crazy, it doesn't make any sense, that's an irrational rule. Well, it's perfectly rational from the point of view of an institution that wants to create an unlimited number of criminals. That's the goal of the state. So why would you put an institution that is an incentive to treat people ever more unjustly, to achieve less and less justice in the world, to cause ever more human suffering at other people's expense? Why would you put that institution in charge of the most important thing, or what is justice in the world? Why do we do this? It's a mistake, essentially. And I don't know of anybody who covers this subject better than Clarence Darrow. Well, I said I was going to go 30 minutes. I've already gone 40 minutes, so I've gone a little over time. We're a little late starting. I urge you to read this book. It makes it all the more interesting that it was written, 110 or so years ago, 113 years ago. He goes through the whole system of criminal justice and points out other errors that we as libertarians tend to make. We all think that the laws in society should be obvious. We think we know what they should be. Don't trample on a person or property. Well, it turns out there's been no state in the history of the world that thought that should be what the law should be. It should be limited to that. First of all, there's no consistent definition about what is or is not property. We know that slavery lasted several millennia. We know that even now people consider intellectual property to be a valid form of property. There's no agreement on what property is. What it means to transgress against a person is very vague. What seems to be clean rules are actually not clean at all. But no state has even limited itself to those functions. Every state has done everything else. From banning child labor and immigration in our time, regulating the kinds of shoes you can wear, or your hairstyles, or your words, or censorship, which has always been a part of the life of the state. And every state has a different definition of what law is, showing in a way just how completely arbitrary it really is. Again, I think libertarians carry around in their heads some mythical view of a state that's never existed, one that perfectly complies with our imaginations of what a state should do. Well, in fact, it turns out that no state in the history of the world has ever complied with what we think a state should do. It's a unicorn, as Mike Munger actually pointed out recently at the FIORG website. So let's just give up. I would urge you to just completely give up this idea that the state should have any kind of monopoly on what is a crime and what is not a crime, much less pretend to enact criminal justice. There is no such thing. The purpose of the criminal justice system is not to manufacture more justice, but to manufacture more criminals. And then so far as it does a good job, it does a very good job in this area. This subject has to be taken on and has to be thought through. I can promise you this: you think you know libertarian literature, you think you know what freedom and justice is, you think you already know what kind of government and society we ought to live in. Read this book. It'll challenge everything that you think. It's remarkable. His comments even about the death penalty are just awesome. It'll bring you a real sense of passion for, I'm cautious to say for anarchism, because I think that's actually too insidious. How do I say? It's too alarmist a term. It's too intense. What I think it does is it brings you a passion for having a normal society, by which I mean a society without state. I think that should be the normal condition of humankind. just people getting along, gradually working their way towards having a normal life, in absence of this violent apparatus of a ruling class that exploits us, steals our stuff, and pretends to make us safer or more holy or whatever it is the state does. Everything the state does to reinforce the ruling class at our expense. This is his view. And by the way, there's a really beautiful aspect of Cranistero's writings too. He's pro-commerce, you know? So he's not a communist, he's not a socialist. He's a revolutionary only in the sense that he wants normal life to be normal. It shouldn't be systematically unjust. It shouldn't be systematically horrible for people. And the only way we can guarantee such a result is to not have a state at all. So anyway, I urge you to read the book. It's not going to take a long time. It's a short read, and it'll totally blow your mind. I have a hard time believing that you'll ever look at the world again. It makes sense of so many things that you think are like random events. Oh, look, this person was unjustly treated. Oh, can you believe it? That person's in jail for whatever reason. I don't understand. Can you believe that guy? You get 20 years for distributing a marijuana cigarette. Suddenly, when you read Cranstero, you understand that this is all part of a systematic, institutional, totally expected failure of any society with the state. Yeah, let me just close by saying a couple of things. My friends, first of all, thank you for belonging to Liberty.me. I think it's a beautiful community. I learn so much every day from the writings that they're pouring out. Whether I agree with them or disagree with them, I just love the gatekeeperless publication system we have, and the forums and just everything going on. I just love to see people just at long last being free, you know, and that's what Liberty.me enables. It thrills me. And people usually describe me as an optimist. I am an optimist about human nature, about human society and everything else. There's one thing I'm not an optimist about, and that's politics. And I believe that we're entering in the U.S. into a very you can see the entire establishment in panic. And normally, under normal conditions, I would just be thrilled to see the establishment in panic, except there are things that are worse than the establishment. In this case, I would say that worse than the establishment has a name, and that name is Donald Trump. I believe that he is a very dangerous fascist, a brown shirt, and potentially very effective dictator. And I'm terrified about about what democracy could actually yield. I've never been particularly against. I've always been against democracy, but you know there are degrees of against, right? And I've always had some sympathy with Mises's position on democracy that allows peaceful transition between governments, and that's better than revolution. So I haven't felt a particular. Yeah, I could read Mencken about democracy, and I laugh and I'm amused and more or less agree or whatever, but not really felt that sort of sense of urgent passion about the cause. Suddenly, for the first time, I am feeling that, because I think I know what Trump represents. He represents a very dark and dangerous form of statism that we are not used to being alert to. Libertarians are not aware of dangers from the right. We're always consumed by dangers. We're basically red hunters. We still buy into the Red Scare from the 1920s. You know, we understand that what an egregious thing socialism would be for the world, and left communism, and we're forever attentive to any institutional shifts that push against them. But we're almost completely blind to dangers from the right because we're not familiar with it. We don't know what the terms are. We're unable to recognize the cues and the signals. We don't know who they are. We ignore the brown shirts in our midst because they mostly hide in dark corners. But I'm just telling you that this man has somehow, you know, opened the panels to the basement where all the rats and roaches live, and they are coming out in droves right now. So to support this man who's giving they used to be dog whistles. These are not dog whistles. These are audible horns, you know, that draw on people's most base natures of, longing for homogeneous, nativist, patriotic societies of rooted in religion and military strength, ruled from a dictatorial center. I mean, it's the most anti-libertarian candidate in my lifetime who's ever been popular. And I say that even considering, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and, every other, John McCain, you name it. Nothing compares to this guy, and he's enormously popular. So it's scary to me because I love the common man, common person on the street. I think they make brilliant decisions as consumers, but as consumers of politics, I think what we've got going on here is one of the great errors in American history, and I'm terrified about where it's going to lead us. We think we have a problem with criminal justice now, and the state surveillance. I mean, this is a man who called for the death penalty for Edward Snowden. That's pretty much all you need to know. But there's a lot more to it because his ideology represents a kind of composite of fascistic thinking that's straight out of the interwar era with a peculiar American spin. Wouldn't you know that when fascism came to the United States, I think it was Sinclair Lewis who said, who was it that said this? That when fascism came to America, we'd be carrying a cross, something like that. Yeah, a little bit of a cross, but actually enormously successful capitalistic businessman and media star. That's our fascism. That's the way it comes to the United States, and people are unaware of it. I'm feeling ever more passionate about the subject. I hope it doesn't turn into an obsession, but I think if there's ever been a time to be obsessed about a trend in politics, it is really now. I think that's what it means. I think that's what the Trump phenomenon means for America. What's the best way to fight it? Live as free as you can. Learn. I can't think of a better book to kind of school you and me. And the true nature of the state, its ruling class roots, its functioning, its ambitions, and why it is not the right means to make the world a better place. Under no circumstances, there's nothing the state can do to make the world a better place. And everything that you're asking the state to do, and Trump has a lot of ideas, is going to make the world less prosperous, less free, and spread human suffering. So now's the time. Now's the time, my friends. Thank you for belonging to Liberty.me, and thank you for joining me tonight. I apologize for a slightly wonky connection and visuals tonight. I should have brought my lights, and I should have brought a better connection with me, but live and learn every week. We always get better. Thank you so much. All the best, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye. Dropped out of history. And one of them is the Tolstoy anarchist school, Christian anarchism. Sometimes, and I understand why people are slightly reluctant to read this literature, sometimes when people tell me about, oh, there's a great lost anarchist, so-and-so, you should read him. I'm a little reluctant because I figure like any amount of their thought, from the late 19th century, early 20th century, maybe going back, 17th century, oh, here's a 15th century anarchist you have to read. It's like, my bias is to think like anything that's worth reading, if there were any ideas worth preserving in that literature, then they would have been absorbed into the modern anarcho-capitalist trend, and we should be able to discover them, all of them, by reading, and all the authors I love, Rothbard or David Friedman or Frank Chodoroff or whatever. And so I tend not to visit those people because the other problem is that you typically bump into errors like crazy views on sexuality or criminal justice or property rights or Proudhonian weirdness, and it's just too eccentric. I'd rather just read the pure modern stuff and sort of get my ideas from that. Well, so this book though is really an exception. So it's not it's somehow not made it into the canon. How can I say this? It's not in as part of the canon that that modern anarcho-capitalists normally think of as being part of theirs, and I think it's tragic. And I don't know how to account for it except to say this is an oversight. The book is by Clarence Darrow, and it's one of the greatest books I've ever read in my life. In fact, people ask, what book do you recommend? Should I read on liberty-minded political economic? Clarence Darrow was, of course, the defense attorney in the Scopes Monkey trials. He defended a teacher of evolution against a criminal prosecution. People forget about that case, that it was actually a criminal prosecution. It was illegal to teach the theory of evolution, and the teacher was being, and Scopes Monkey trial was being held for violating a law on a criminal basis and faced jail time. And Clarence Darrow was the defense attorney in the case. Very famous guy. He was a defense attorney all of his life. And I'd never really understood that he had a bigger theory of the world until I read this book, Resist Not Evil. I'd never heard of the book until Douglas French, great thinker, former president of the Mises Institute, a great man, a serious intellectual force in the world today, drew it to my attention. And it was one of those books where I started reading it, and nothing else mattered. At that point. I don't know if you've ever seen any examples. I talked about Chodorov. I love that Chodorov book on the rise and fall of society. Talk about Martin van Creveld on the rise and decline of the state. Mises' liberalism. Obviously, Rothbard's For Under Liberty, which is kind of a composite of all existing libertarian thought as it stood in 1972. Machinery of Freedom. There are many books, too many to name here. But I don't actually believe that one's understanding can be complete until you discover and read Resist Not Evil by Clarence Darrow. By the way, tonight's broadcast is going to be short. I'm only going to do 30 minutes here, so I'm going to have to move very, very quickly here through this book. I'm doing this because we've got an editorial meeting at the Foundation for Economic Education in town, and we're all doing all sorts of things that are exciting and revolutionary for the future. So, but I could talk about this book for hours. Okay, good. I mean, this is a slightly strange room. It looks like a light storm was hitting me in some weird way. I don't know how to know. I'm at the Ardmore Hotel in Atlanta, Georgia, which is just a lovely old-fashioned hotel. That's actually sort of it is an old hotel, but it's been patched up and fixed up. Anyway, I'm excited tonight to introduce to you a book by Clarence Darrow called Resist Not Evil, which was written in about let me just look here. I think it's I think it's 1902, which is an unbelievable point that is written in 1902. Because what you have here, and here's why I think this book is important. I mean, there are many varieties of anti-statist, libertarian thought that are not crazy, that are really compelling, really practical, consequentialist and rights-based libertarianism that have somehow